Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled American Culture in the Gilded Age. Now, obviously, we'll not be able to talk about every aspect of American culture, but there are some themes that I'd like to go over here. Among those is that of the people of the dominant culture, that is, the Anglo-Saxon Old Stock and Scots-Irish from the colonial era, there was a bifurcation of American culture during the Gilded Age. This is when American culture separated into highbrow and lowbrow. The result was that one particular canon of culture, European literature, plays, and music, became available only to the middle class and the upper class. This changed a horizontal shared culture into a hierarchical culture and a signifier of class status. Cultural authority concentrated more fully into the hands of those with money. This shift eventually secured the specialness of middle-class culture to discipline yet refine the so-called mob. Let's see where this bifurcation took place, or at least an example of this bifurcation. Let's talk about Shakespeare in America. Now, there are many examples of how Shakespeare was mutilated in American culture and in particular American letters. Mark Twain's mutilation in Huck Finn of Hamlet's soliloquy by the so-called Count is one example, and it relied for its humor on the listener's knowledge and understanding of that original Hamlet soliloquy. There are many examples of the ubiquity of Shakespeare among people of modest means that would have understood quite well the joke of this mutilated soliloquy. De Tocqueville noted that, quote, "There is hardly a pioneer's hut that does not contain a few odd volumes," unquote, of Shakespeare. Illiterate mountain man Jim Bridger hired someone to read Shakespeare to him until he could recite the passages. And you remember that scene in the 1996 movie Tombstone, in which an actor recites Henry V on a bar stage. This was not unusual. People of any education at all, even home education, in an era when the only two books in the house were the Bible and a volume of Shakespeare, understood and knew and were very familiar with Shakespeare. Like the Elizabethans, a substantial portion of 19th century Americans knew their Shakespeare well, according to Lawrence Levine in his book Highbrow, Lowbrow. Shakespeare was as ubiquitous in the language and imagery of the people as were biblical allusions. Well, why was Shakespeare so popular? There was an emphasis on individual acts and responsibility that fit with the American worldview. There was a clear dichotomy between good and evil, and there was scarce competition. Also, American culture had a high regard for oration and eloquence. The change and move away from Shakespeare occurred with a drop-off in relevance for oratorical style, possibly because of new immigrants and their languages. And there were dozens of foreign language newspapers, and many national cultures that were not English had their own plays and literature. There was a rise of literacy that deprived Shakespeare and the oral culture of dominant power, and there was a decline in the concept of the romantic idealism in U.S. taste, that is, the philosophy of German Romanticism. This slide discusses the sacralization of Shakespeare, that is, the making of a temple of Shakespeare instead of a forum in which people can engage Shakespeare on their own. This began in the 1850s with a cult of Shakespeare and continued into the 1890s, in which intellectual elites claimed that the so-called mob did not have understanding or refinement to understand Shakespeare. Shakespeare went from being an object of entertainment to being an object of critical study. And the rise of commercialism led to a rise of anti-commercial intellectuals who wanted to lift up art, literature, and drama as legitimate, and the legitimate could only be displayed to the discreet. There was a shift in the business model of play production as well, with the centralization of theaters and tightened profits. Refined audiences, those with money, would not sit with commoners or come to a place where rowdyism was rampant. On the other hand, there is a development of popular culture in the entire culture. We've talked about the bifurcation of culture in the Anglo-Saxon, Scots-Irish cultures. Now we're talking about a broader culture. This development of a more popular culture came with urbanization and immigration. It also developed along class lines, though there were some things like vaudeville and baseball which saw a mixing of the classes, at least men of different classes. Let's talk now about vaudeville. Vaudeville was a variety show that featured skits, farces, comedians, magicians, singers, minstrels in blackface, animal acts, recitations, and many other things. It was turned into a business by impresarios who built theater chains and contracted groups of acts who went on tour. Baseball is also a more common pastime. It was not invented by Abner Doubleday, as the story goes, but by New York City bank clerk Alexander Cartwright. In 1845, Cartwright put together the first team, the Knickerbocker Baseball Club of New York. The first professional team was the Cincinnati Red Stockings, formed in 1869, but after colleges formed their own teams, there was virtually no distinction between amateur and professional teams. They played each other on a regular basis. Baseball was racially segregated, with blacks playing in a separate Negro league. Occasionally in the 1890s, black and white teams played against one another, but for exhibition games only. And of course, until World War II, baseball was gender segregated. We talked about the class development of culture, and popular culture really shows this and demonstrates another aspect of the bifurcation of American culture, at least along class lines. Yachting in Cape Cod and horse racing both rose in prominence in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. If there was a high price tag, then that led to exclusivity in things like yachting and horse racing, and these were further promoted by the development of exclusive clubs for the wealthy that kept the so-called riffraff out of boating and horse racing in urban areas, demonstrating the same bifurcation of culture as what happened with Shakespeare. There were middle-class cultural pursuits, and because this class tends to focus on the middle class, at least in the progressive era, then we will look a little more heavily at this one. One of the main aspects of a developing middle-class sports culture was outdoor recreation and sports. Bicycling grew after the 1886 introduction of the so-called safety bike, the one with the smaller front wheel, into a large industry that peaked in 1897. Middle-class urbanites traveled to the countryside on their weekends, and women gained a measure of freedom by being able to travel on bicycles on their own or with very few chaperones. Bicyclists were the first large group to experience any real sensation of speed while traveling. That is, most people never traveled on the railroads at 12 to 20 miles an hour. They tended to travel on foot or on horseback or in carriages at approximately 3 miles an hour. Bicyclists could travel at 10 to 15 miles an hour, and so speed became somewhat ubiquitous. There developed a cult of speed that influenced a lot of literature, a lot of the ways people thought about what was relevant in their lives. Most of these bicyclists, particularly the weekend bicyclists, were the first groups to campaign for better roads in the countryside that ultimately led to the development of the federal highway system. College sports blossomed, with field hockey being introduced in 1879, ice hockey being introduced in 1895, lacrosse being introduced in that period, and basketball being introduced in 1891. Other sports that were introduced in this era included lawn tennis, 1874, with Central Park in New York City hosting 30 courts by 1885. Golf also entered the U.S. as a predominantly middle-class and upper-class sport in the 1880s. The middle class also engaged in watching the rich. After the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which was originally on the site now occupied by the Empire State Building, created its famous Peacock Alley, many members of the middle class vacationed to New York City just to watch the rich promenade. In the 1890s in particular, there was an era of celebrity worship, particularly as young, rich American women were being married off to British aristocrats. The women brought wealth, the men brought titles and access to a broader world of the aristocracy, often with little wealth. Then there was a working class culture. This developed in the urban environment. Remember, most workers were from rural areas. They lived rural lives, and they were squeezed into tiny living areas, so they lived their lives in public. This was also the beginning of mass consumerism, and recreation was one of its first markets. A saloon culture developed for men and was extremely important. Even though prohibitionists decried rampant drunkenness, saloons were really social clubs, employment centers, and dining facilities. This is not to say that temperance workers were wrong, just that they might have exaggerated the prominence of the problems a little bit. Dance halls and amusement parks sprang up mostly for single men and women to meet in their new environment. That is, new in the sense that older rules were breaking down, while it was taking a while for new rules of decorum to become accepted. The archetype amusement park area is Coney Island, New York, where the first rides went up in 1876. The working class could take a trolley out and they could afford the cheap rides while socializing. There were actually many amusement parks on Coney Island, as well as other resort accommodations such as hotels, and there were other places that had amusement parks as well. Also, there was Bloodsport. Football, though it began in colleges, became a working class spectator sport of choice after baseball, in part because it was violent. Now, boxing was extremely violent with workers, but also with other classes. Until 1892, boxing was bare-knuckled, with as many as 30 3-minute rounds. And these were fought by the Marquis of Queensberry rules that are somewhat apocryphal, but actually did play a role in how boxing developed into a sport that wasn't just a melee. A popular champion was John L. Sullivan, shown here on the right, who was champ from 1889 until 1892. He was beaten by Gentleman Jim Corbett, who you see in the image on the left, who boxed with gloves and remained champ from 1892 to 1897. Corbett fell to Bob Fitzsimmons in 1897, which is not particularly important except in boxing lore, except that the Fitzsimmons-Corbett match was the first boxing match to have a movie made of it with national distribution. Now, this was not a movie like you and I would think of, even as a newsreel. It was a different kind of movie, very short, and ran in arcades of the era. Another form of culture is this idea of joining. I'd be remiss if I didn't speak about the cultural phenomenon of clubs that increased after the Civil War and peaked about 1910. Men, women, workers, members of the middle class, and the wealthy joined, both black and white, into various kinds of clubs. There was the Young Men's Christian Association, the Young Women's Christian Association in the 1900s, the Young Men's Hebrew Association, the Knights of Columbus. These were all religiously inspired. Masonic orders arose, like the Freemasons and Oddfellows, which were somewhat exclusive. They spread throughout small towns and the countryside, as well as large urban areas. New middle-class commercial and social clubs arose, like the Elks, Moose, Woodmen of the World, and various offshoots of Masonry. Heritage organizations arose. The Sons and Daughters of the Revolution, Sons and Daughters of the Confederacy, the Colonial Dames were all for Anglo-Saxons, but the Ancient Order of Hibernians and the Sons of Italy appealed to the Irish and the Italians. Women's clubs expanded as well. These were often small and aimed at mental improvement. Among whites, they tended to be for the elite. Black women's clubs were service-oriented and open to a wider variety of women. The white women's clubs formed the General Federation of Women's Clubs in 1895, and a year later, 1896, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was formed. So in summary, social life and culture during the Gilded Age tracked trends of class development, urbanization, immigration, and emerging mass consumption. A highbrow and lowbrow culture developed, as did mass consumption-oriented popular culture to entertain concentrated urban masses. Well, and as usual, this ends the lecture, and thank you for your time.